You are sitting in a cool room. A fan turns slowly above you, pushing a soft current of air across your face. Your skin feels dry. Your water bottle is cold enough to gather tiny beads on the outside, and when you lift it, the first swallow slides down your throat like relief. Outside, the sun may be brutal, but you do not have to negotiate with it. You can close a door. You can lower the blinds. You can press a button and make the room colder in seconds. Your ancestors had none of that. In the Sahara, the ground could become hot enough to burn bare feet. Shade was temporary, water could disappear beneath the earth, and the wrong decision could turn a normal journey into a fight for survival. So the question is simple. For hundreds of thousands of years, without air conditioning, refrigerators, plastic bottles, weather apps, or reliable maps, how did ancient humans survive desert heat at all? The first answer is uncomfortable. They did not survive by overpowering the desert. They survived by refusing to fight it on its terms. Your modern life teaches you to treat heat as an inconvenience. The room gets warm, so you cool it. Your body gets thirsty, so you drink. The road becomes dangerous, so you wait for better conditions. Your ancestors understood something different. Heat was not a problem you solved once. It was a schedule. It was a landscape. It was a predator with habits. And if you learned those habits, you could stay alive. The oldest known fossils of Homo sapiens were found at Jebel Irhoud in Morocco. In 2017, researchers dated them to roughly 315,000 years ago. These early humans were not living in the exact Sahara we see today because North Africa's climate changed dramatically over time, but they belonged to populations that already knew how to move through harsh, dry environments. They carried stone tools made with a method called levallois. That sounds complicated, but the idea was simple. You shaped a stone carefully, so one strong strike could produce a sharp, useful flake. A good tool meant better cutting, better hunting, better access to food, and less wasted energy. Every movement mattered. You did not wander beneath the afternoon sun because you felt like exploring. You moved when the temperature allowed it. You watched the horizon for dust. You remembered where animals gathered, where plants survived, and where rain had recently passed. The desert was not empty. It was a puzzle, and your ancestors learned to read it. The first weapon against heat was timing. Modern people often imagine desert survival as a test of endurance. You picture a lone traveler crossing endless dunes under a white sun, forcing one exhausted foot in front of the other. That image is almost completely backward. The smartest desert traveler did not prove strength by walking through the hottest part of the day. They avoided it. Human bodies are remarkably poor at dealing with extreme heat when they are active. As your muscles work, they release heat. Your heart must pump blood toward your skin to help cool you, while your body loses water through sweat. If the air is dry, sweat can evaporate quickly. If you keep moving, you can lose more water than you realize. You might feel merely tired at first. Then your judgment begins to fail. Then your body starts shutting down. Your ancestors had no thermometer to tell them when danger was approaching, but they had something more useful: repeated experience. They knew that the desert changed character after sunset. The same sand that punished your feet in the afternoon could become cold enough to steal warmth from your body at night. So movement shifted with the temperature. People traveled during cooler mornings, late afternoons, or moonlit nights. Camps were arranged around shade, wind direction, fuel, and access to water. A journey was not just a line from one place to another, it was a sequence of safe windows. Here's what nobody tells you. Survival often looks less like courage and more like refusing to be reckless. At the prehistoric site of Wadi Kubaniya in Egypt, archaeologists found evidence of human occupation dating to roughly 18,000 years ago. The site was near an ancient lake and contained hearths, animal bones, and tools. It was not a random campsite. It was a carefully chosen place where water, food, fuel, and shelter came together. That combination was everything. Your ancestors did not need to make the entire desert comfortable. They needed to find small pockets where life was possible. An oasis, a riverbank, a rock overhang, a shallow depression where rainwater collected, a valley that trapped moisture, a patch of vegetation that revealed water hiding below. They moved between these pockets like stepping stones. Think about that for a second. A desert can look infinite, but survival depends on tiny details. A line of greener plants might mean a buried water channel. A cluster of birds might point toward a spring. Animal tracks could reveal a route that humans had not yet noticed. The landscape was speaking constantly. You only died if you stopped listening. The second answer was shade. Today, shade feels like comfort. For your ancestors, it was infrastructure. A tree was not just a tree. It was a roof, a landmark, a source of food, a signal that water might be nearby, and sometimes the center of an entire settlement. A rock shelf could become a bedroom, a shallow cave could become a workshop, a depression in the ground could block the wind and lower the temperature just enough to preserve energy. The difference between sun and shade can be enormous. Direct sunlight loads your body with heat, while even a narrow strip of shadow can reduce that burden. Ancient people did not need to understand radiation physics to feel the difference. They only needed to notice who survived the afternoon and who did not. So they built their lives around absence: the absence of sunlight, the absence of wind, the absence of exposed skin, the absence of unnecessary movement. At the Contrabandier's Cave on Morocco's Atlantic coast, archaeologists discovered more than 60 bone tools in layers dated to between roughly 120,000 and 90,000 years ago. A 2021 study argued that many of these tools were likely used to work hides and animal skins, possibly including clothing. The evidence does not prove that every early human in the desert wore loose robes like people in later desert cultures. But it shows that humans were already making and shaping materials to control their relationship with the environment. Clothing is usually associated with cold. That is only half the story. The right clothing can protect you from the sun, reduce direct heating of the skin, and slow water loss. Loose layers can create a thin pocket of air around your body. Covering your head can protect the scalp and face. A fabric surface can take the sunlight instead of your skin. Your ancestors did not need synthetic fibers. They needed clever layers. Animal hides, woven plant fibers, grasses, and later wool or linen could all become tools for managing heat. The exact designs varied across regions and periods, but the principle was consistent. You do not expose your body to the desert simply because the air is warm. You create a barrier. That barrier could be clothing, it could be a roof, it could be a wall, it could be the shadow of another person standing beside you. Because the desert punishes isolation. A lone person carries every problem alone. A group carries water together. A group watches for danger. A group remembers routes. A group can care for a sick traveler, protect children, and maintain a fire after dark. Heat makes cooperation practical. At Gobero in Niger, archaeologists found hundreds of burials dating to periods when the region was not always a barren desert. Around 10,000 years ago, parts of the Sahara were greener, with lakes, grasslands, and wildlife. Later, as the climate dried, human communities shifted and reorganized around shrinking water sources. The desert was not a permanent background. It expanded and contracted. The people who survived were not simply the strongest people. They were the people who noticed change early enough to respond. The third answer was water, but not in the way you imagine. When you picture desert survival, you probably picture carrying a container filled with drinking water. That certainly mattered, but ancient humans survived partly by learning that water existed in many forms. They drank from rivers and springs, of course. They collected rain. They dug into wet sand. They followed animals. They used plants. They extracted moisture from foods. They stored liquid in skins, gourds, shells, and later pottery. But the more important skill was knowing where water would be before you needed it. That is a completely different kind of intelligence. You do not wait until your throat is dry. You plan backward from the next safe source. You calculate distance by memory. You judge how much food and water the group can carry. You decide whether the season is favorable. You leave before the water disappears. And you teach the route to someone younger. A desert map is not just a drawing. It is a memory passed from one generation to another. Some of the earliest evidence for humans living in extremely dry environments comes from the Kalahari. At the Gamohana Hill North Rock Shelter in South Africa, archaeologists found evidence that people used the site around 105,000 years ago. The remains included ostrich eggshell fragments and calcite crystals, suggesting that humans were visiting and using the interior of southern Africa during a period when researchers once assumed people mostly stayed near coasts and permanent rivers. Ostrich eggshells were especially useful. They were strong, they were light, they could be carried over distance. Once emptied, they could hold water. A small container changes everything. It turns water from something you must find immediately into something you can carry toward tomorrow. Here's the part nobody talks about. The greatest desert technology may not have been a tool, it may have been anticipation. A stone blade helps you cut food. A water container helps you survive the space between food and water. But knowledge tells you where that space ends. Your ancestors memorized seasonal streams that disappeared for most of the year. They recognized mineral stains around springs. They tracked the movement of elephants, antelope, and birds. They knew that a dry riverbed could still hold water beneath its surface. The surface lied. The ground looked dead, but life often continued underneath. In some desert environments, people could dig into old river channels and reach damp sediment. They could squeeze moisture from plants or chew water-rich roots. They could choose foods that delivered both calories and hydration. This is why a desert diet was never just about eating enough. It was about eating intelligently. A handful of seeds, a piece of fruit, a tuber, or the meat of an animal could also become part of the body's water budget. Hunting was not only a search for protein, it was a search for everything the animal had already gathered from the landscape. An antelope had found water. Your ancestors followed the evidence. The fourth answer was food, and food was harder than thirst. Water can keep you alive for days. Heat can make every meal expensive. You cannot chase animals under the midday sun without paying for it. You cannot burn more energy searching for food than the food gives back. You cannot depend on one plant, one animal, or one season. So ancient humans became generalists. They ate what the desert offered, when it offered it. At Jebel Irhoud, archaeologists found animal remains associated with early Homo sapiens and Middle Stone Age tools. The site included evidence of hunting and processing animals such as gazelles and bovids. A sharp stone edge could separate meat from hide, crack bones for marrow, and transform a carcass into food, clothing, tools, and fuel. Nothing was wasted. That is not romantic. It is arithmetic. A desert makes waste visible. The skin becomes covering. The bones become implements, the fat becomes energy, the tendons become cord, the horns become handles, the dung becomes fuel. The animal becomes a temporary extension of the landscape. Your ancestors did not walk into the desert with a giant survival kit. They learned how to turn one success into many forms of protection. But hunting in hot conditions required a different kind of strategy. Humans are not the fastest land animals. You cannot outrun a gazelle in a sprint. Your ancestors had other advantages: persistence, teamwork, tracking, and the ability to cool themselves through sweating. Many animals avoid overheating by panting, hiding, or stopping. Humans can keep moving while sweating across much of the body. In the right conditions, especially during cooler parts of the day, a coordinated group could pressure prey over distance. This strategy is sometimes called persistence hunting. The name sounds clinical, but the reality was brutal and simple. You followed tracks. You watched the animal's rhythm. You kept moving when it rested. You waited for heat and fatigue to make the animal vulnerable. It was not a chase. It was a negotiation with exhaustion. Of course, it only worked under specific conditions. The ground had to allow tracking. The weather had to be suitable. Water had to be available afterward. A failed hunt could cost more energy than it returned. So your ancestors combined hunting with gathering, scavenging, fishing, trapping, and sharing. The obvious answer is that desert people survived by being great hunters. The deeper answer is that they survived by avoiding dependence on any single answer. Think about that for a second. A community with one food source can starve after one bad season. A community with 10 food sources can survive several disappointments. Flexibility is not a personality trait here, it is a life support system. The fifth answer was fire and shelter. The desert is famous for heat, but the desert also becomes violently cold after dark. Sand and rock do not hold daytime warmth the way forests and cities do. The temperature can drop quickly once the sun disappears, especially under a clear sky. Your ancestors had to survive a world that attacked from both directions, burning overhead, freezing beneath the stars. Fire solved more than cold. It turned darkness into time. Around a fire, people could cook tough foods, soften plants, preserve meat, harden tools, scare predators, repair equipment, and tell stories. Cooking also made calories easier to access. Heat outside the body could make food safer and more digestible inside it. At Gesher Benot Yaakov in Israel, archaeologists found controlled fire use dating to around 790,000 years ago, including burned plant and animal material. The site is much older than Homo sapiens, but it shows how deep the human relationship with fire goes. Fire was not a luxury. It was a second environment. Inside its circle, your ancestors could do things the desert would not allow in the dark. Shelter worked the same way. A shelter did not need to be a permanent house. It could be a windbreak made from branches. It could be a hide stretched over poles. It could be a wall of stones. It could be a cave chosen because its entrance faced away from the strongest sun. The goal was not beauty. The goal was changing the temperature around your body by a few degrees. That small difference could determine whether a child slept safely, whether meat spoiled, whether an injured person recovered, or whether a group had enough energy to travel the next morning. At the prehistoric site of Tamar Hat in Algeria, researchers found evidence of early human activity in North Africa dating back hundreds of thousands of years, including stone tools and animal remains. Sites like this remind you that the Sahara was never simply a blank space between civilized places. People were there. They were adapting there. They were leaving behind small, scattered traces of decisions made under pressure. And because the desert preserves some things unusually well, it can hold on to those traces for a very long time. The sixth answer was social memory. This is the part that changes the entire story. Ancient humans did not survive desert heat as isolated biological machines. They survived as families, bands, and communities that stored knowledge outside any single brain. One person knew the spring, another knew the plants, someone else knew which ridge became dangerous in a sandstorm, an older hunter remembered the year the lake vanished, a mother knew which foods were safe for children, a teenager learned the route by walking it beside someone who had walked it before. Knowledge moved through bodies. It moved through stories. It moved through repeated rituals. It moved through the decision to stop at one place instead of another. When people migrated across dry landscapes, they did not carry only tools and food. They carried an invisible map made of remembered landmarks, seasonal patterns, animal behavior, and warnings. That map could outlive the person who first created it. At Abu Huraira in northern Syria, the settlement was occupied for thousands of years, spanning the transition from hunting and gathering to farming. Archaeologists found evidence of changing diets, changing plants, and changing climate. The community's history shows that human survival was not a single breakthrough, it was constant adjustment. When the environment changed, people changed with it. Around the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago, climate shifts transformed many regions of Southwest Asia. At Abu Huraira, people altered what they gathered and eventually began cultivating plants. Farming did not appear because humans suddenly became more intelligent. Pressure pushed them toward a new arrangement. The same pattern happened in deserts. When water moved, people moved. When grasslands dried, diets changed. When animals became scarce, tools and travel routes changed. When a reliable spring became unreliable, memory became more valuable than strength. Here's what doesn't make sense until you think about it. The desert may have helped create the kind of intelligence humans became famous for, not because it made life easy, but because it made mistakes expensive. You had to plan, you had to cooperate, you had to imagine tomorrow's weather, tomorrow's hunger, tomorrow's distance. You had to care what happened to people who were not standing directly beside you, because your survival depended on what they remembered. The desert trained anticipation. It trained patience. It trained the ability to see invisible systems behind visible emptiness. And still, survival was never guaranteed. For every group that crossed a dry basin, another may have turned back. For every settlement preserved by archaeology, countless camps vanished beneath wind and time. We often tell human history as if your ancestors simply progressed from one clever invention to the next. They did not. They failed constantly. They ran out of water. They lost children. They missed seasonal rains. They followed the wrong animal tracks. They misjudged a journey. They arrived at a spring and found mud instead of water. The people who survived were not protected from disaster. They were the descendants of people who managed to recover from enough disasters to keep the story going. That distinction matters. Because when you look at an ancient desert settlement, you are not looking at proof that humans conquered nature. You are looking at proof that humans learned how to remain vulnerable without becoming helpless. Your ancestors had no control over the sun. They had control over when they moved beneath it. They had no control over where rain fell. They had control over how they remembered it. They had no control over the desert expanding. They had control over whether they shared the last container of water. That is a different kind of power. Not domination. Coordination. And perhaps that is why desert cultures, separated by thousands of years and enormous distances, repeatedly developed similar habits. Covered skin, shaded courtyards, thick walls, night travel, careful water storage, seasonal movement, and intense respect for roots and wells. The solutions were not identical. The logic was: reduce exposure, preserve water, follow food, use shade, travel together, learn from people who have already survived the place you are entering. It sounds obvious now. It was not obvious while someone was dying of heat beside you. Winter came at your ancestors with 4 weapons: thirst, burning sun, freezing nights, and empty food routes. They answered with timing. They answered with shade. They answered with containers, clothing, fire, tools, memory, and one another. They did not make the desert harmless. They made themselves difficult to erase. And that may be the philosophical answer hiding inside the practical one. Human survival was never about becoming perfectly adapted to one environment. Your ancestors lived through deserts, forests, coastlines, grasslands, mountains, and sudden climate shifts because they carried something more flexible than fur, claws, or speed. They carried the ability to change behavior. A body can sweat. A mind can imagine. A group can remember. Together, those abilities let a fragile animal cross landscapes that should have belonged to something stronger. The next time you sit in a cool room, notice how much invisible history is packed into that comfort. You hear the fan turning above you. You feel cold water against your palm. You step across a floor that does not burn your feet. You close a door, and the desert becomes a distant idea. But somewhere inside your body is the inheritance of people who once measured a journey by shadows. Somewhere inside your habits is the memory of those who moved before sunrise, rested beneath stone, carried water in eggshells, shared meat around fire, and taught a child where the hidden spring waited. You are comfortable because thousands of generations refused to give up. And the people who survived the desert did not defeat the heat, they learned when to disappear from it.